Good morning, everybody. Welcome to this press conference with the first Special Rapporteur on the promotion and protection of human rights in the context of climate change. The UN Human Rights Council established this new mandate at its 48th session in October 2021. And Mr. Ian Fry was appointed to this role by the Human Rights Council at its 49th session in March of this year. He began his mandate on the 1st of May and presented his first report to the Council just yesterday. This report was published on the Special Rapporteur's page on the OHCHR website. If you haven't seen it, you can get in touch with myself, Rolando or Pascal, and we will help you get a copy. So without further ado, let me invite Mr. Fry to make a short statement, and after that, we'll take some questions. And please don't forget to introduce yourself and your media, because the Special Rapporteur is new, and he would like to understand who it is asking the questions. So over to Mr. Fry. Thank you.
Apologies. Yes, sorry. The devastating effects of climate change are having serious implications throughout the world. Just in March this year, in South Asia, there were record high temperatures, the highest temperatures ever recorded in history. However, these costs are not being met by the international community and are being primarily ignored. The Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change clearly shows that climate change is upon us, and we have to do something about it. Not only is there a huge economic cost, but there is also a non-economic cost. Where I come from in the Pacific, people are losing graves as a result of the seas washing away their loved ones. The critical issue that I've reported in my report is that I've identified 6 key issues that I want to deal with. The first is around the elements of how climate change is being addressed, looking at the mitigation, adaptation, and particularly giving emphasis to loss and damage, because this is a critical area that seems to be being ignored. I also want to look at the issue of climate change displacement. There's a huge number of people, an intolerable tide of people moving as a consequence of climate change. In 2021, there were 59 million people internally displaced as a consequence of a variety of measures, but primarily as a result of climate-related events. So this is an enormous number of people, and this is higher than the number of people displaced as a consequence of conflict. The other issues I want to look at are particularly around looking at legislation and litigation, climate change cases, and particularly the issue of intergenerational justice. For our young people who now have an uncertain future, we want to guarantee their future. I also want to look at the issue of just transition for people who are working in the fossil fuel industry, how they can move safely from that industry to new greener technologies. And I also want to look at the new technologies that are being used, potentially used to address climate change, like geoengineering and other measures. So they're the sort of key steps that I want to look at. And I certainly particularly are concerned about this issue of people displaced across international borders. They're not defined as refugees under the Refugee Convention, and therefore fall through the cracks as far as legal protection is concerned. So thank you very much, and I look forward to questions.
Thank you, Mr. Fry, and the floor is open to questions. We have none in the room, so anybody online, please raise your hand, and we're ready to take your questions now. I see Jérémy Lange, Radio France. Please ask your question.
Thank you so much. just a quick question. I would like to know, is it the more damages you have, the more climate warming you have effects, I mean, on a country, the more attacks you will get on human rights? Is that as simple as that?
Yes, it is. We can look at it quite simply. You know, the people's right to food, to shelter, to access to water, the rights of women are all being affected as a consequence of climate change, and particularly, temperature increases. The right to life, basically, where lives are being lost as a consequence of climate change.
Thank you. I also would like to call on Mr. Jamie Keaton of the Associated Press. Thank you, Jamie, for your question.
Good morning. Thank you so much for having us. Sir, because you're relatively new in this job, I wanted to know if you could tell us a little bit about the reaction that you have gotten from governments about your findings. In particular, do they seem receptive to your message? Obviously, you've been granted this mandate, so somebody supports your idea, the job. But what is the receptivity for this issue? Because of course, governments have to change their policies in order to respect your recommendations. Thank you.
Yes, well, I had over 87 countries respond to my presentation yesterday in the Human Rights Council, and the vast majority of those were supportive of the position, almost unanimous support for my position. So there is a clear realisation of the connection between human rights issues and climate change.
Jamie has a follow-up. Thank you, Jamie.
Thank you very much. I just want to make sure that, I mean, it's one thing to have words that they say in the Human Rights Council forum, but what I'm trying to get from you, if I can, is what beyond this, the sort of public forum have you heard from governments in terms of their willingness to actually take concrete action to ensure that that there's no fallout on human rights from environmental damage and various other concerns that you have?
Well, I've had a number of sort of bilateral meetings with some countries, and they're obviously concerned. I think this is only early days as far as making the linkage between human rights and climate change. You know, I've had a long history of climate change negotiations, and the connection with human rights, it hasn't been all that strong. And I think countries are starting to realise this connection between human rights and the climate change agenda. And so they're starting to realise that they're going to have to do something about it. Of course, there are countries who are already feeling the impacts of climate change. You know, I was approached by some sub-Saharan African countries, expressing to me their concerns about the human rights impacts on their country as a consequence of climate change, and encouraging me to do more about it. I think some of the more advanced, developed countries are starting to realise a strong connection, from their own personal experiences of the heat waves that have been around in recent times, and the need to, make that link between human rights and the climate change agenda.
Thank you for that. Now I'd like to turn to Mr. Christophe Vogt of Agence France Presse. Christophe.
Hello, thank you for taking my question. I was just, as you just said, climate change and human rights touches on a vast array of domains, and the UN has already a lot of experts in those. So I was just wondering, how are you going to work together? Are you going to coordinate, maybe to make your voice stronger?
Yes, thank you. a number of special rapporteurs have looked at the issue of climate change, and I've had good discussions with them. I met with the Special Rapporteur on violence against women recently to discuss her next report, which will be looking at climate change and violence against women. There are clear connections there, particularly with women who are displaced from their homes as a consequence of climate change and put in vulnerable situations. So I'm working very closely with a number of rapporteurs. We've had exchange of views on a number of issues around the connections, and we'll certainly be coordinating our work.
Thank you very much for that answer. Now we have a question from Annie. Can you please give us your full name and the media that you work for before you ask your question? Thank you so much. Annie.
Yes, hi, I'm Annie from Phoenix TV, and I'd like to ask, the government and courts are not active, and so far the environmental laws still do not include the expression of environmental rights. Do you have any comments about that?
I'm terribly sorry, we can't really hear your question. Your audio, sorry to interrupt, your audio is not very good. Our technicians are asking if you would like to exit the Zoom and reconnect. We may be able to get a better audio connection, and we'd be happy to take your question then. So in the meantime, I see there's a follow-up from Christophe of AFP. Christophe, you have the floor.
Thank you. Can you hear me?
Yeah. Yes, we can. Loud and clear.
Okay.
Thank you.
Yeah, I was just wondering, Mr. Fry, if you could give us a little bit more on what you were saying about the whole technologies that are studied, maybe to change the climate. You were talking about geoengineering, and maybe if you could elaborate a little bit more of how you see the link between human rights, this kind of technological changes that are envisaged to mitigate climate change. Thank you.
Yes, thank you. These sort of new technologies cover a sort of broad range of technologies. Certainly, direct air injection, changing and brightening of the cloud brightening could impact people as far as food production is concerned, depending on where it's taken place. There are also issues around what's called bioenergy and carbon capture and storage. So this is where the burning of wood products to produce electricity is being considered and being developed as an alternative to the use of coal-fired power stations. But the sourcing of that wood products is a serious concern for some people. Certainly, I've had discussions with Sami people in the Nordic regions, and they're concerned about their land being taken over by wood plantations for this bioenergy production. There are some countries in Africa where this is where timber is being sourced for fuel wood production, going into these wood-fired power plants. So there's a variety of issues. In the Pacific, we've looked at the issue of iron filings being put into the ocean to increase the absorption of carbon dioxide, and there are potential impacts for fisheries and hence human rights implications as a result of that.
Thank you so much for that question. We have a question in the chat from our colleague Bodhi Hugger, who represents Phoenix TV. He asks, the government and courts, I think he means governments in general, and courts are not so far active in environmental laws, and they don't include an expression of environmental rights. Do you have any comments to this statement?
Well, there are a number of court cases being held around the world. There was a recent case in the Netherlands last year. So there are a number of cases being held, questioning the role of governments in setting targets for climate change. There are, court cases against companies. So there's a variety of litigation that's before the courts at the moment. And one of the critical issues that I want to look at is access to courts. I've met with youth and groups who are concerned that they don't get access to courts in some jurisdictions, and I certainly want to look at that, because the critical issue is the voice of youth is critical to be heard in these sorts of court cases.
Thank you. I see Annie is still on the line. If you'd like to unmute, maybe we can take your question this time. Perhaps the line is clearer. Go ahead.
Yes, sorry, I'm Annie from Phoenix TV, and my colleague Bodhi has just asked the same question, so thank you.
Okay, that's great. Thank you so much for persevering with us. Are there any more questions online? Yes, I see Christophe would like another go. Christophe Vogt, Agence France Presse. Thank you, Christophe.
Thanks. It's great to be able to ask so many questions. One of them is, given the all-encompassing problems that climate change brings to the world, do you see any scenario where you have to balance human rights, the definition we have of human rights, with the fight against climate change?
Yeah, I think there are some areas where there are linkages, and that links to this issue of new technologies as well, I guess. If we do overshoot the 1.5 degrees Celsius target that's been set in the Paris Agreement, and the impacts increase, there may have to be, some drastic measures taken to reduce the global temperature. And that's around some of these technology fixes, atmospheric technology fixes. So the challenge is that, are the human rights impacts of climate change greater than the human rights impacts of these technologies? And this is a critical issue that I will want to look at as part of my mandate. I don't have an easy answer for that. I had some dialogue with an expert yesterday on this issue, and it is a challenging issue for the world to think about. Are these new technologies and their impacts going to be more significant than the overall impacts of climate change? So I'm certainly be looking at that issue.
Great, thank you. And Jamie Keaton, Associated Press, one more time.
Thank you. I hope I'm not abusing, but as Christophe, I can't be outgunned by my dear colleague Christophe in terms of number of questions. I just wanted to follow up a little bit on his question, but also just about the sort of general priorities that you're going to have. For example, you mentioned that you're working with other special rapporteurs. What about other UN agencies? I know your report refers to the Refugee Convention, and of course, refugees are very often, we're seeing migration and refugees often being driven by the impact of climate change. So how much are you working with organizations like UNHCR? And then my second question has to do with about again on Christophe, a little bit more specific, to try to find out, for example, specific case scenarios that are your priority. For example, in Africa, we hear about people burning wood and various things that contribute to climate change at a small scale level, but they're also survival issues for a lot of people. We've heard from ILO in particular concerns about the tobacco growing industry that has impact, or WHO, I think that was actually, it was talking about the impact of tobacco, which is growing, which has an impact on health, but also is obviously a livelihood for a lot of people. You also have Germany starting to fire up more coal plants in response to that has an impact on air quality in Europe. There's any number of issues like that. So what could you just give us some of your major priorities in terms of drawing that strong linkage between climate change and human rights? Thanks.
Yes, well, to first answer your first question, I guess, is linkages with other UN agencies. Certainly, I'll be having dialogue with the UN refugee on refugees. I've already, made contact with UN Women, the UN Convention on Desertification. I've had meetings with them and United Nations Environment Programme. So I'll be reaching out to a number of UN agencies around these issues. And of course, the High Commission for Refugees is a critical part of that. With regard to the sort of particular issues that I want to focus on, clearly the fossil fuel industry itself is the major producer of greenhouse gases. So that's clearly a focus of where I want to look at and how to look at the connections of what they're doing on human rights. And certainly that will connect with work, looking at legislation, looking at litigation, and corporate responsibility is what I want to, another key issue I want to deal with. So this is where businesses, financial institutions are investing in the fossil fuel industry, and so I want to pursue the issue of disclosure around disclosing the investments in fossil fuel industry and businesses that are disclosing their risks to the impacts of climate change. So this is another critical area that I want to focus on.
Okay, thank you. Last chance for any more questions. Maybe not Christophe or Jamie. Okay, here we go. Magali, representing Kyodo News, but Magali Bosha, please ask your question, Magali.
Mr. Frey, I would like to know if you're going to engage directly with countries that are skeptical about your mandate, such as Russia and then Japan and India as well. And if you can tell us more about why they are skeptical. And the second question is, if you think that the resolution that was adopted, I think at the last session on the right to a clean, healthy and sustainable environment is going to help you in your work. And if yes, how concretely is that going to help? Thank you.
If I understood the question correctly, I've certainly had bilateral meetings with India and Japan, and they were very good discussions. And I think they, understand the critical importance of my new role, and so that's important. I worked very well with colleagues from the Russian Federation during climate change negotiations, and I think it's just a matter of them understanding this issue a bit more, that they'll come on board to this issue. With respect to your second question, can you ask that again, please? Oh, sorry, I've got it now. Thank you. So the issue is, how will I work with a special rapporteur on the rights to clean environment, clean, safe and environment? Well, I've certainly had a dialogue with them. Previously, he's covered the sort of issue of climate change. So we'll work out where our respective roles will fit into this place. The critical issue immediately for that is, there was a resolution last year in the Human Rights Council on the rights of a safe, clean environment and healthy environment, and that's now currently before the UN General Assembly, and I've been offering my support to the Special Rapporteur to support that resolution before the UN General Assembly.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Fry. So I don't see any more hands. And if nobody wants to ask another question, then I think we're coming to the conclusion of this press availability. Thank you all so much for joining us. Stay tuned for the bi-weekly press briefing, where my colleague Rolando Gomez will have some news for you. And have a good Friday and a good weekend. Thank you so much.